This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week, we're very fortunate. We're joined by yet another distinguished historian, this time someone who's really been a pioneer not only among historians and scholars, but also among labor activists and political change agents around our country for many, many years. This is Nelson Lichtenstein, who is a distinguished professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Nelson, thank you for joining us.
Delighted to be here.
Nelson is the director and founder of the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's a historian of labor, political economy, and ideology. He's written and edited a whopping 16 books. I can't keep up with all of Nelson's writing. Two of my favorite books, not just that he's written, but two of my favorite books that I impose on all students on the history of labor in American society. Nelson's absolutely essential biography of Walter Reuther. It's called Walter Reuther, the Most Dangerous Man in Detroit. He was the head of the United Automobile Workers, which was one of the most progressive unions in American society, mid-20th century. Nelson's also written a book my graduate students love called State of the Union, A Century of American Labor, which is really a phenomenal survey of the changes in American labor unions and work in America over the last century. He has a forthcoming book called A Fabulous Failure, Bill Clinton and American Capitalism. And most recently, Nelson has published an article in Dissent magazine that we'll make sure to link to the podcast. The title of that is This a Strike Wave? Discussing the current issues around labor and particularly many Americans choosing during COVID not to return to their low-paying jobs in many different parts of our country and what that really, really means. We're going to talk to Nelson today about how work and labor organizing have changed in American society over the last few decades, what that means for today, and where we might be going, how this history of labor and history of work can help us to understand our current COVID moment and maybe the future moment we're entering into right now. Before we turn to our discussion with Nelson Lichtenstein, of course, we have Zachary Suri's scene-setting poem. What's the title of your poem today, Zachary?
Soon to be, but not yet.
Let's hear it.
The belt whirs and then stops. The bus turns another corner and stops. The broken or the tired out or the soon-to-be but not yet important all turn around and face the door or take the clock off the wall, and the time stops. The time stops, and words can take back their meaning, and there is something more than the cold commands pasted on the bathroom wall. And now you have forgotten the logic of the cafeteria line, and there is something colorful again in eating, in pausing for a second and looking at the bread of a field of wheat someone else had to reap. And suddenly you are a person. There is, after all that, something inside you worth smiling at, worth saying please and thank you to over a grocery store checkout counter, worth looking yourself in the eyes for and saying into the mirror, you matter. Or you are simply exhausted, and you shouldn't have to be exhausted anymore.
That's wonderful imagery, Zachary. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about trying to understand why so many people are quitting their jobs today, and also why we're seeing a increasing amount of organizing among workers in this country.
That's a perfect place to go to our discussion with Nelson Lichtenstein. Nelson, how do you think about this current moment in America? Some people are complaining that they can't get enough people to come work as waiters in their restaurants and as people doing other work. How do you understand this moment?
Yeah, good poem, by the way, Zach. Well, I think, I make a couple of, let me put this, sort of a structural and then a kind of cultural comparison. Structurally, it's like a war. Like World War I, World War II. And in a war, what you have is lots of disruption in the labor market, people moving around different jobs, some industries sort of ending almost like, civilian production, and others absolutely booming. Meanwhile, the federal government's pouring in tons of money in deficit, to sustain either the war effort or here with the pandemic, sustain the economy. And so what that does is it creates tremendous labor shortages some places and big unemployment other places, and you can't switch them. You can't labor doesn't move that quickly, So that's what we have really. It's more like the beginning of World War II, when the auto production line shut down for cars anyway, and they revved up for planes and things like that. So and then of course wages are there's a tremendous demand for labor, so wages go up. So that's one thing we have, which is and I think that's given rise to this so-called labor shortage, which we've had. Secondly, is this cultural, moral, social. I mean, it was dangerous. Again, the analogy to war. Soldiers were venerated in World War II. Coal miners were too, to a degree, because that was difficult, important work. And so the so-called essential workers, frontline workers, there has been a sort of sense, and here it's not just some lefty, writing about the dignity of work. It's millions, tens of millions of people experiencing it directly, and I think that's had an impact. And so you have this phenomena today where there has been a great, what would they call it, the great resignation, or choosing carefully where to work, and then that makes demands for higher wages, et cetera. So I think that is a real thing. It is happening. Some people are panicking over it. It's clearly not simply a question of incentives, that people have too much unemployment insurance. That clearly is not the case. And so that's again, I think it's analogous to wartime, and post-war as well to a degree. Once the thing is over, we had huge strike waves in 1919 and 1946. Now I don't think we're going to get to that right now, but some of the same sentiment is there about the role of labor in a society in general.
And so, Nelson, if we could just drill down on so many of the excellent points you made. First of all, how do we know this is not people just deciding to stay home because they're receiving a government check? That's the stereotype, the false stereotype that's being put out there by some people. How do we know that's false?
To some degree, that's true, and I applaud it. And that is when you have a lot of rotten work in a society and low-wage work. Sometimes, and people are only being coerced to do this work because of a lack of the sort of the erosion of the welfare state. And like unemployment, by the way, is just desperately and terrible form. We don't really have an unemployment system. Sometimes, if someone is getting, usually not a welfare check, but some form of money has been, there were these, individual checks that were sent out for $1,200, or sometimes unemployment insurance, and sometimes just money for the to sustain the business. And at the bottom of the labor market, I think that's an entirely salutary thing that people finally have some extra cash of a different sort. And then, of course, Biden is trying to get through these family allowances, which would be the same sort of thing, and that will have a tremendously salutary impact on forcing low-wage employers just to raise their wages in a kind of massive and substantial fashion.
Right. So you see that as a good thing in terms of improving.
Absolutely. Look, what have we been talking about inequality over the last 40 years here, and the 99% and all of that. And we've been going on about that for years, and a few little tweaky. The government, taxation policy and even welfare policy was never enough to change that. What really changes is when employers, and I'm not talking about here and there, I'm talking about the bottom half of the working class. Employers at the bottom, when they raise wages substantially, and I'm talking about 50%, not some little. That's what's going to do it. That's what's going to, and that happened in World War II. That was when the greatest moment of equality in American incomes was World War II. Not because the rich got taxed so much; they get it somewhat, but mainly because tens of millions of workers had good paying jobs. Incomes in Mississippi, in black agricultural income in Mississippi quadrupled during World War
Wow.
II. Well, I'd like to see a doubling or quadrupling of McDonald's wages.
What has the state of organized labor during this pandemic been like? It seems like there's been an increasing push for labor organization, but at the same time, there seem to be facing stronger and stronger pushback.
Well, it's basically, terrible. Yes, of course. This is. I mean, what the other phenomenal thing about this moment, a kind of extraordinary thing, is all the sort of macroeconomic indexes. Labor shortages, money. Even now, a Democratic president who's in favor of unions. They're all favorable to labor, to organized labor. But in contrast to the situation 50 or 60 years ago, which would create a spurt of union organizing, and it hasn't. And the reason for that is that on multiple levels, the obstacles to actually forming a union, whatever the sentiment of the workers, are just, there's this sort of multiple, as it were, veto points. The law is terrible, and I go into it, but it's just terrible in many directions. Companies have perfected, almost down to a science, the way in which you stop a union, from being formed, even when the workers clearly want it. That's true right now. Starbucks is demonstrating that in Buffalo when some like 50 baristas want to form a union, and Starbucks is sending in, $1 million vice presidents to stand behind the counter and stop it. I mean, it's just incredible. So that on those two things, and one of the most remarkable things is we haven't had a spurt of union organizing. Not that labor's tried to, and others have tried to. It's just it's so difficult. And I made this point in that little article in Dissent that the unions that are on strike that we hear about right now, the John Deere, where the UAW, right. They just rejected a contract, by the way. The Cruise in Hollywood and others. They're part of unions. The unions were formed 80 years ago during the Great Depression. We don't have a strike in Silicon Valley. There is no union there.
So Nelson, it's so important, and you know this better than anyone, for people to understand how vital unions were to protecting workers, but also to the growth of the American economy after World War II in particular. And you've written more about this than anyone, yet I'm always surprised how little people know about this. Why are unions important? Why should we care?
Well, in terms of macroeconomics, sort of just general growth, I mean, they're a more effective Keynesian mechanism than any, as I said, tax policy or even spending policy. I mean, they directly get money, and when they're successful, and that's what happened in the Great Compression from the 40s to the 70s. I mean, there were other reasons as well, but unionism was one of them. And unions don't just do things sort of in one factory or one workplace. They are political instruments as well. And they were the pillar sustaining the New Deal order. In this book I'm writing on Clinton, one thing, I mean, Clinton, I view him actually sort of less of a neoliberal and more of, in some ways, a new left liberal. But what he didn't have and couldn't have and was a labor movement that didn't exist, or it wasn't strong enough, or it was in disrepute in that period. So here he was trying to create a liberal project, a liberal without a labor movement. And I think frankly the problem that Biden is encountering right now with the social infrastructure bill is in part, where are the troops? Where are the troops? They don't exist. West Virginia used to be a highly unionized state. It wasn't, with even Jay Rockefeller was right. The senator of West Virginia, and he was a big liberal, a good liberal. And West Virginia's had the greatest degree of de-unionization of any state in the last 40 years. It's toward the bottom now. Well, that institution doesn't exist. So Joe Manchin only listens to coal mine operators or Wal-Mart or whoever else he's listening to.
So what is your response to the stereotype, the the view that's often put forward that unions were corrupt and that they didn't help workers. This is obviously not true. So how should we understand the governance of unions when they worked well in those years, the 40s to the 70s?
No, I mean, there has been corruption of unions, and you can actually the recent scandal in the UAW, I think, is a product. The UAW used to be always known as extraordinarily almost Spartan, clean, a non-corrupt union. And then we've had recently this corruption scandal there. And I think one reason for it was it followed a long period of an effort at collaboration with the auto companies, and that was a demoralizing, and I mean that in a kind of the moral. I mean the purpose of a union is to represent its members in whatever it can, and this was demoralizing in that respect, and created this sort of sense of a kind of insider collaboration, and that happened. I mean, that's the downside. There's a lot of academics have made their careers on arguments about worker management, cooperation, collaboration. Well, the downside of that is corruption, and corruption, whether it's illegal or really the more importantly, a kind of political corruption where the unions don't do what they're supposed to do. So that, I mean, it's there. The Jimmy Hoffa is the most famous unionist in American history. He was trying to have it both ways, actually. On the one hand, sometimes he could be quite militant, but other times he just completely accommodated trucking firms or mafia-infested locals, and he there's certain, how should I put it? There's almost a vacuum in American culture which demands a corrupt union leader. Certainly, that's true in Hollywood.
Do you think there's space in our current economic moment during this pandemic for unions to play a bigger role in our economy?
Yes, and here's where I think it might happen. It's more than space. I mean, I think it's something almost that Biden and some of the people around him, many of them, by the way, came out of the Clinton administration, but I think they've learned something. They've been chastened. They know that they need troops, and some people understand that if you want to defeat Trumpism, you can't just write off the working class. And here I don't just mean the white working class, because as we saw in the last election in 2020, a lot of Latinos and even black men, they didn't all vote for Trump, but more of them than we would have expected voted for Trump. So you can't just write this off as Senator Schumer at one point said, "Oh yeah, we'll just win the suburbs, and we'll let the old industrial working class go any way it wants. They can have." That's a huge mistake. So there's a political necessity for it. The other thing is this, and this is a theme I'd like to hammer about a bit, Alyssa. It's when we've had social movements that have triumphed, it's because the opponents of those social movements have come to the conclusion that it's much better to reach an accommodation with that social movement than to try to resist it, because the cost of resisting, whether it's money or politics or public relations, is just too great. So the Me Too movement would be an example of that, or the Black Lives Matter recently would be an example of that. When we see, all sorts of companies, of celebrating their degree of racial or gender equality. Well, the union movement it's now entirely legitimate for a company to say, "Oh yeah, we're going to smash this union," basically, or we don't think the union's in the best interest of our employees. Sort of like saying, "Oh, we don't think racial equality is in the best interest of our employees." That would be laughed out of town. So I think it's possible that in this period when inequality is so much in front of us, and when unions have achieved today a tremendous public support, greater than any time in many decades, that some companies might come to the conclusion, well, resisting unions is going to be a real egg in our face, a real political problem. I think it's beginning to happen in Silicon Valley, actually. And therefore, maybe we should reach some accommodation. That's what happened in the late 30s. That's what happened in public employment, by the way, in the 1960s with unions. So I think that's what happened actually in the California agriculture with the farm workers. The companies came to see that it was in their interest to recognize unions, not because it's going to increase productivity, that not some equation that's going to make it economically better, but for purely political reasons.
And how do we get over then the negative stereotype we talked about, and also the ways in which politicians, from the Scott Walkers to the Donald Trumps, seem to spend all their time bashing unions?
Well, I mean, Scott Walker certainly did. Trump started off actually in a kind of, I don't know, who's to say? Well, right. Well, I do think that I think Scott Walker's moment is over. Actually, I do think that's over. The sort of the beating up on public employee unionism and public employees was a function of Obama era austerity. I think that may be over. Undoubtedly, there's a tremendous amount of residual hostility to unions all over the country. There's no doubt about it. But I think when you have, but clearly, let me say this: clearly, among the 20, 30 something journalistic, bloggers, and kind of who, for example, rushed to Bessemer, Alabama last winter to cover this effort to organize Amazon. I mean, in some ways, what I found most startling about that moment was not that there was a unionizing attempt at Amazon or that Amazon won. That was sort of, I knew they would win, frankly. They've been winning anyway. But that the enormous amount of attention that was given to it by the, otherwise, coastal elites, young coastal elites. And I think that reflects the same way in the 1930s, you had New York intellectuals rushing to Harlan County to cover the coal mines, and and in the 60s, you had young radicals from the colleges engaged in the civil rights movement, whites I'm talking about. Well, today, there seems to be a beginning of that kind of attention to a union movement, which doesn't really exist. It doesn't exist, but they're looking for it. So I'm heartened by that.
No, there's a lot to that. It's a very good point. I guess the puzzle for me, Nelson, is that so many of the white working class voters, those we'd think of in the past as being members of unions who voted for Lyndon Johnson, many of them have become in that profile Republican voters. In fact, they're the mainstay. They're the people who vote for Ted Cruz in Texas and Donald Trump in various places. How do we see them? How could they become part of a union movement, or is the union movement going to appeal to different people?
Well, I did want to make 2 points. One is that vision, which Trump, by the way, loved to surround himself with white male, coal miners and stuff, which was such an artifact of an earlier moment. I mean, the union with the working class today is multiracial, and California, it's practically entirely Latino, and I mean the blue collar working class, and also of course half women, et cetera, and many immigrants. So the reality of what is the American working class today is it is multiracial, multicultural, and heavily women and heavily immigrant. Okay. So that's one thing. But secondly, yes, there are white male workers in and out of unions, by the way, who are reactionary or Trumpites. And I think it's like, frankly, it's like the stuff in East Germany, where the rise of, or other places, where you have industrial decline in northern England, where, you have this sense that, traditional institutions of liberalism didn't work, so we'll move to the right. So you have to make the traditional institutions of liberalism, whether it's the union or the state or whatever, make it work. And Biden's trying to do that. That's why there's been a certain left-wing enthusiasm for this guy. It seems to be, whether that happens or not. So I think that's true. But I would make more. I would push. I'm not for writing off the white working class, or such as it is, but we really forget that the working class today, the people who are working in Amazon, working in McDonald's, working in Walmart, working in your local hospital, they are women, people of color, and immigrants. I mean, that's the working class today.
Right. And many of them now are working from home, right? I think of people at call centers.
The ones who have sort of white or pink collar jobs, they are not the ones who are doing the service economy. That's part of
Fair enough.
What's been put upon them. But yeah, there is people at home. Yes, that's absolutely the case.
And so how do we think about that? How does that, can we imagine a union movement for people who are in, as you call them, pink collar, right?
Yeah.
Relatively low paying jobs at home, taking care of children at the same time. Do they fall into this as well?
Well, they do. Well, they're harder to organize, obviously, when you have a scattered workplace. And of course, companies aren't stupid, so they kind of construct work which is fragmented or fissured. That's the reason. That's the word where you aren't even officially an employee of a firm. You're working for a subcontractor. That's harder to do. It's still true. It's still true what Marx and everyone else said. You put people together in a workplace, and you have something is possible there, rather than when they're scattered about. And I don't quite think that the internet and Zoom and the world of Zoom quite brings people together as much. Although I have to say that you've had some remarkable things in Silicon Valley. And let me just say something about that, the motivation of unionism. It doesn't have to be for dollars and cents and a better, dollar an hour and whatnot. The people in Silicon Valley, when you had 60,000 people at Google who walked off the job because they didn't like the gender politics of the leadership, or they even forced, I think, Google to reverse some of its policies on helping, the Pentagon, I believe, identify people. So whatever the issue is that brings people together collectively, I mean, that's what helps create, form an organization. And the problem is that we still have so many obstacles to the actual legal formation of these organizations that's still there, and that's part of our problem today.
And I wanted to ask you about that in particular. What are the obstacles we would need to remove in order to allow for what you would see as fairer unionization?
Well, there's a number of just things. For example, the capacity of employers to intimidate workers in a variety of ways, captive audience meetings, firing them, and saying the reason we're firing you has nothing to do with the union, but we're firing you anyway, even though you're a unionist. The delay. That is when you finally do a majority go for a union, the companies just delay the first contract, and that demoralizes people. So those are just a few of the things. Now the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, does reform many of those things. The Republicans are completely against it, so it doesn't have a chance in Congress. But I want to get back. Even if you passed the best possible liberalization of the labor law, it wouldn't work unless you really frightened employers into the realization that it's in their best interest to recognize the union. I mean, in the 30s, the revolution was a word tossed about. We weren't going to have a revolution in America, but we were going to have a radical movement. And a lot of employers said, "Oops, let's not do that." And then actually what they did, they rushed to sign contracts with the American Federation of Labor, the more conservative of the two big labor movements in the 30s. Right. So I'd be happy to have Walmart sign a contract with the most conservative trade union that they could find right today.
That's a great example. So we always try each week, Nelson, to bring this historical perspective that you've shared with us, as no one else can. We try to bring that into the present and really think about how it can be used by people who are out trying to make a difference today. And so, what would be your advice to actually many people? Zachary and I know here in Austin, Texas, a fast-growing city, one of the fastest-growing cities in the country. where there's a lot of efforts at union organization because there is a labor shortage and there are many workers who are still being poorly paid despite that labor shortage. And there's a great deal of money, and all the major corporations are here, from Google to Dell to Samsung and others. What are your recommendations to them if they're trying to help workers through unionization today? What should they be doing?
Well, I think obviously publicity is the first thing. And I think we do have a lot of talented, sort of, as it were, organic intellectuals of the working class. And that would include most of the people in the academy who are have been sort of semi-proletarianized anyway over the years. And I think that therefore a kind of and that's been happening. And I'm for doing more of it to publicize what's going on and to see these issues that are there in terms of class issues, and not so much. Well, they are racial and class issues are imbricated together, no doubt about it. But I think there's sometimes we fixate on the specifically racial or ethnic character of the working class oppression, and don't see it as a more generalized class one. And secondly, is naming and shaming. This has been a tactic of the left for decades, and I'm for naming and shaming companies. Whether in Austin and elsewhere, employers that are clearly being egregious or hypocritical or what have you. But I have to say, Jeremy, I don't have a magic solution.
Sure.
I'm not Lenin who is getting off the train. I mean, I wish I did, but anyway, that's what I.
Well, that's super helpful, because I think one of the issues is ignorance. I mean, I find that there are many people who care about inequality but don't think about labor issues, and I think one of the, as you said, one of the great outcomes is that people are thinking.
Yeah, and the union movement is the mechanism for the abolition or the reduction of inequality, and I think it's the most effective one and the most direct one. One of the problems with federal policy or even when state policy, it takes so long to get itself down to the people who are the beneficiaries, and then when they get it, they don't know why it happened. But a union is right there. They have to struggle for it. They know why they're getting $1 an hour more. They understand it, and unionism has a tremendous impact on consciousness, not because they listen to speeches or get leaflets, but because the very act of doing something together with someone else is a consciousness transforming thing, which puts a certain kind of narcissistic individualism. It reduces that, and you begin to see a kind of collectivity. I mean, we see that today with this terrible thing on the resistance to vaccination. People don't see the collective necessity of that. But when you're in a union, if you're on a strike, you know damn well that everyone has to stick together if you want to win.
Right. It's community building, or I guess the phrase used now, social capital, right? Nelson?
Yeah.
Zachary, as a young person who watches all this and talks about these issues, I know, how do you think about unionism? Or do you share Nelson's view that this is a direction we need to think more about today?
I do 100%. I think part of the problem, though, is that the image of the union that we're still operating with today, even people my age, is the like Rodgers and Hammerstein, like 1920s union of the pajama factory. It's not a modern image, and I think we need to update. We need to bring our imagining of unions up to date.
I think that's right.
Excellent point, Zachary. That's absolutely. I agree with you 100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And Nelson, this is why we need you to keep writing, so you can help us update our image of the unions, right?
Jackie, write that up, Zachary. That's really good. That's a good point.
Well, I think this is a perfect note to close on. Nelson, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights with us. And I want to encourage all of our listeners to read your books and your articles as we're trying to bring a renaissance and attention to the workplace in our country today. So thank you, Nelson, for joining us.
You're welcome indeed.
And Zachary, thank you for your poem. And thank you most of all to our listeners for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.